Well, hello everyone. Welcome to episode 2. In this episode, I want to talk about economics instead of a political issue. Mostly because I want to tie political issues back to economics. And I wanted to make sort of a base video where I could refer other more advanced topics back to this video. So what this video is going to be is 4 basic economic things that I think you should know to A, understand the world, and B, understand some more advanced economic topics that I'm going to be covering in later episodes, such as GDP and things like that. So, number 1, before I get to the 4 economic facts, I think I should cover why I think economics is really necessary to understand the world and how it works. Economics is the study of how people interact, really. It's sort of an applied, I guess, sociology. It's more of a grounded sociology, in my opinion. Economics is really the study of how humans act in order to better themselves. To couch it in some terms that I'll be explaining in another episode. The view of the Austrians. So when we use economics, we're really using it to describe how people act in not only in a market situation, but in any situation where they seek to produce or consume or trade. All the ways in which someone wishes to better themselves. And economics can tell you various things like why nations rise and fall, why people grow wealthy, why people are poor, so on and so forth. So I think it's really necessary to understand economics to understand how the entire world really works. So I want to cover 4 basic things in here. And the first one is this myth of something called intrinsic value, that things have value in and of themselves. So what do I mean by that? I mean, like, if we take something like a shovel, people will say, well, that shovel has value in and of itself because it allows you to have more productivity than you would have otherwise. It allows you to dig better holes faster, essentially. And this is misleading because things are not valuable because of how they're used, and they're not valuable in and of themselves. So the most basic way that we can disprove this is that if there were no humans, the shovel would not have any value whatsoever, because no one would be using the shovel. Value is not a property of the shovel, because if that were true, and there were no humans, the shovel would still have a property called value, as much as it has a property weight or mass. But humans are necessary for anything to have value. Humans prescribe values to things. And value is a judgment. Each person has a different value system. So that's another myth, is that people believe that intrinsic value is not necessarily a property of the item, but something that we can all agree on. And this is also a very odd view, because we do not all value things the same way. I do not value, for example, alcohol. I don't drink alcohol. I don't particularly like it. I would hold alcohol's value to me at basically 0. But other people value alcohol and like it a lot. So again, value is a judgment that you prescribe. And so let's take a much more extreme example where value judgments can be very different between people. Let's take the America in the 1930s. And since I just watched Fiddler on the Roof and I kind of like that play, let's take Russia at the same time period. I think it took place in the 1930s. So in the play, one of the characters gets a sewing machine, and this is a huge leap in technology for these people. These people are very poor Russian peasants, basically. And so if you take that sewing machine for them, that is a huge increase in their productivity, and they value that sewing machine a lot. But if you gave that same sewing machine to someone in America, they would value that a lot less than the people in Russia do, because they already have sewing machines in much greater abundance than they do in Russia. It's a much less marginal improvement in their productivity. And so if you take something that would be possibly of equal value to the Americans as the sewing machine is to the Russian peasants, a car, and gave it to the peasants, they would have almost no value for it because they don't have any gasoline. Like they wouldn't even be able to have the tools necessary to tear it apart for scrap. And even then, what would they do with the scrap metal? I mean, not much. They value sewing machines much more than cars because they can't even use the car. And so this just shows how huge diversity in value judgments a person can have. And so things don't even have to have a use value. People think that, like I said before, that items have to be somehow useful in order to have value. And this is not the case at all. I mean, like, for example, I own these little figurines that I have over on my dresser. They're these little statues that I bought for $10, and I think they look pretty cool. But they have absolutely no value other than looking cool to me. They're not used for anything. They're just pieces of plastic. I mean, a more general example is jewelry. You know, jewelry, diamonds have usage in certain industries, like diamond tip drills and everything. But those are usually synthetic. But normal diamonds in jewelry, that has no usage. It just looks pretty. But people value diamonds anyway. And for the longest time, this confused economists like 300 years ago, because they were really, really like confused why people valued gold more than water. You know, people drank water all the time, and yet gold was much more valuable than a gallon of water, an ounce of gold. And they couldn't reconcile this fact until they realized that value is not a universal constant. The value is a specific thing to each person. So why is this important? Because if you assume that value is a constant thing, then you can prescribe your value judgments onto other people. So this is what we see like government officials do all the time. They think something is important. They think something is necessary to do, but general populace opinions be damned. They think that their opinions on value are right when their opinions on value are right for them. So we have to realize that value judgments are a very personal thing, and you can't prescribe your value judgments to other people.
Another reason why this is important is because it disproves something called the labor theory of value, which is one of the fundamental tenets of Marxism. And what it basically states is that things are valuable because people work on them and put their labor into them. This is a very misguided view for several reasons. Number one, because if I put hours and hours of work into, say, digging a hole in the ground, nobody cares. That's not adding value to anything. No one is going to pay me $50 to dig a hole in my backyard. And the reason that the labor theory of value is put forth by Marxists is because it justifies action against managers. It justifies violent action against managers that they call the expropriation of the expropriators. Basically, they reason that, okay, we're the ones adding value to the product because we're the workers, and we're adding value to products by working on them, and therefore the capitalist is doing nothing to add labor, And so we deserve all the fruits of the labor, which is all of the profit, basically. And as I just explained, it's a very bizarre idea. No one really believes in the Marxist version of the labor theory of value anymore. Even people who call themselves Marxists, they believe in like slightly different versions of it. And even some left libertarians have tried to come up with new like combinations of labor theory of value and other theories of value, and it's a very bizarre position because it's starting off from a moral standpoint rather than a standpoint of describing how the world works. It's instead describing how the world should work, and that's not scientific. That's philosophic, and that's not what you use to describe the world.
So that's economic fact number 1. Okay, so economic fact number 2, and this builds off of the last one. When two people trade for things, like let's say a guy trades a fish in like a market for $5, those two people both benefit from the trade because they both believe that they are getting something more than what they're giving. So what do I mean by that? So the guy who has the fish, who's getting the $5, he thinks that the $5 is worth more than the fish. Otherwise, he wouldn't be trading it. He thinks that, I spent, 3 hours and I caught 10 fish. I believe that the value of my time is, X, and therefore this one fish is worth, it cost me, $2, let's say. And therefore, this guy giving me $5, well, that's a bargain. I made a profit of $3. And the guy who's giving $5 for the fish, he's getting the fish from the other person, believes that the fish is more valuable to him than his $5. Or else he wouldn't be making the trade. And we can infer this because they do the trade. If they didn't think this, then the trade wouldn't happen. If the person who had the $5 thought that the fish was only worth $2, he wouldn't be paying $5 for it. He might go to someone else and give his $5 to somebody else for a different good. To give a personal example, I recently just sold a whole bunch of old games on eBay that I no longer wanted. I thought they weren't particularly good games. I sold them for very cheap on eBay, like, average of $2 to $5. I thought they had no value. That was my personal judgment. But the people who bought them on eBay thought they had at least some value. They thought they were worth like $2, $3, $4, $5. And they might get some use out of them. They might be very thrifty gamers, and they would only buy games for less than $10 to save money. And so those games had value to them. So why is this important? Well, because a lot of people have this tendency to think that, again, their value judgments are the correct ones. And so this is an example that Tom Woods, a famous libertarian, gave. He told about this economic principle in a talk that he gave. And a guy came up to him after the talk and said to him, like, you've really clarified something in my life. I used to work at a department store that sold a ton of CDs, and I thought CDs were worthless, and that we were just screwing these people for selling these CDs for $7. But he realized after the talk that those people, for some reason or other, maybe they just, were technology adverse and they didn't want to go through buying an iPod or something, they valued having those CDs. It's also important to understand that trading is a very beneficial act. Trading benefits everybody that is involved. So we should do everything in our power to encourage more trading because it increases because people now have more things that they value more. And everybody does. And so everybody's the better. The third thing that I wanted to cover, the third economic principle that I wanted to cover, which is equally as important as the previous two, is that when something is manufactured, it could be, I don't know, it could be an iPhone. It could be a CD, to take the two things from the previous example. It could be anything, really. It could even be a website, something that's not entirely physical. When somebody creates that, they are creating something that is worth more to people than the sum of its parts. So in essence, for those people, value is being created. If we take the classical definition of creation, which is something that is made from nothing, then when someone is on the assembly line constructing an iPhone, the iPhone at the end is worth to people $400-ish, because we know that because they're willing to pay for it. It could be $400 or more that it's worth to them. And they're willing to pay for that because the iPhone was constructed from things that were worth less. I wouldn't pay $400 for a pile of, transistors and a CPU, a screen, and just the metal casing just strewn all about. Nobody would. So when you take the pieces necessary to make an iPhone and put them together, you're creating something that is more than the sum of its parts. And this is true with non-physical goods. So like a website, your code is worth more than just the browser, for example. Your browser, without the websites for it to download and show you, it's not very useful at all. But because you created that website, both your website and the browser are now more valuable. And this will be important. The creation of value will be important in an episode that I'll do later on GDP. So this is a very fundamental thing. You have to understand that wealth creation is something that a lot of people don't understand, where we are becoming more wealthy over time because people are taking raw materials and making something completely new out of them that people value more than the original materials. So we are becoming more wealthy, in effect. This is how nations become wealthy. It's like the official title of Adam Smith's book is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, not just the wealth of nations. And the cause of nations being wealthy is people producing things. So it's important to realize that people who produce things are the reason why we're more wealthy. And again, this will come up in another video that I'm going to do on GDP, the measurement of GDP itself. What we're doing, this is economic fact number 4, what we're doing when we realize that when the entrepreneur who, let's say, is creating this website, what he or she is doing when they take the raw materials versus the market price at the end of the final product, and they determine that they should use those raw materials in order to create the final product, what they're doing is something called economic calculation. And that's what people do when they determine what to produce, in what quantities, for what cost, and for what amount of value. And this is very important because it's the basis of entrepreneurship and therefore the basis of really capitalism, is people using economic calculation in order to increase our wealth. So for example, I know that in order to make, say, an iPhone, going with the previous examples, I need $100 in parts. And then I know that I can sell it for $400. Using economic calculation, I realize that I'm going to be able to make $300 in profit. Why is this important? Without economic calculation, you cannot determine if what you're doing is going to make you wealthier. So if you're not selling your product, you have no way of assessing if people value it. So let's take a real world example. The United States spends roughly $12,000 per student on education in a high school. Do we have any way of knowing if that's an appropriate amount? I mean, is it? We have a natural tendency to say, wow, $12,000, that's way too much. But how would you even know? There's no way for you to be able to tell because people aren't willingly paying for it. People are being forced to pay for it through taxes. But if I was to create an iPhone that cost $600 to make and would sell at $900, then I would know that that's way too much because no one was willing to buy it. I know that that was a poor decision through economic calculation. But with the U.S. education system, we have no way of knowing if expenditures are justified. And it's really important because I'll cover this in another video. This is called the calculation problem. And it's a very, very important refutation of bureaucracy and, in the more general case, socialism. So I hope these four things let you understand more about how the world operates. These are, in hindsight, very basic things, but when you apply them more in your life, you start to realize that a lot of the things that people advocate are very misguided. And I will be referencing this video a lot in videos to come on the economic calculation problem and GDP and other such topics. So I hope you enjoyed listening, and thank you very much.